Now we're going to talk about filling our objects and the different things we can do with the fill panel. First, what I'm going to do is create a rectangle, and it doesn't really matter the size, that's good. And what we're going to do over here in our fill palette is click in and get our color picker. So this is pretty standard, right? We're just choosing what color we want this shape to be. But there's a little bit more we can do here. If you look over here, we have an option for noise built in. You can see very quickly and easily I can just dial up that meter and add some noise to a design. That makes for a nice little visual interest, and you can see if I have two of these, maybe I'm doing a design that is all white, and this one will be all white but no noise. If I turn off the border on each of these, you can see that even though this is fully white, the noise does add a little bit of interest to it. So I could take this and maybe make it a little bit of gray. And essentially it's the same, right? But when you zoom in, you can see the texture of the noise. So very close, right? Our eyes from far away register these as basically the same color block. But when you take the noise into consideration, it's just another way that you can add interest and personality to your designs. So if you're going to do many stacked panels or a whole bunch of things in a row, maybe noise is for you. So I'm going to go ahead and just choose a new color here that's a little shocking of a color. There we go, nice yellow. We can dial up the noise on that, and that's our noise option. Now the next thing I want to talk about here is adding a gradient. So instead of color, I'm choosing gradient here. And you can see we have all these different gradient styles. So we can go ahead and have a gradient. And the thing about gradients is you can add additional points to them. So if I want to add a point to a gradient, I would click, you see my mouse turn into a plus. I click there, and that's a new color spot, and I can change the color. Let's change it to something more drastic so you can see my sort of the result. So now we have a new gradient. Well, just like colors, you can go ahead and click this plus button and add that gradient into your repertoire. So I have this gradient, and now I have this gradient. Now, what if I want to delete one of the points? Well, when you click on a point, you see it gets a little thicker white outline, just to show that that's the point you've created and it's active. You can click on that and just tap delete, and the point goes away, and essentially this gradient becomes the same as that gradient once I hit that delete button. Now the next thing about gradients is you select points, and you can drag them along an axis. So that's how you adjust the position of gradients inside of a shape. And you can obviously change the color from there to get different looks for your gradient. Then you can also drag beyond your shape, and if you drag aside, you see I can change the angle. And if I wanted to, I could do something like hold down Control or Alt, and changing the angle always creates an interesting look. That's what changing the angle's like. You can also use smooth opacity here, which tries to put in as many grades of a color that it can in order for the appearance of this thing to remain pretty smooth. It's an interesting option, and it sort of keeps you from getting these solid bars, right? Everything tries to stay pretty gradiated. That's smooth opacity. I'm going to turn that off for a second. I don't really like the effect that it generates. Finally, let's go to one of their pre-made gradients, and we're going to change the style from linear to radial. So now you can see we have a giant circle that's formed. And I'm going to pull this side here and just shrink the circle. And just like we had with our smart guides, there's the snap to the middle, very middle of the object, the two red lines. You can just take and I can spin that. I mean, it doesn't really matter, right? If it's a radial gradient, Then we have this second control up here, which is sort of like Illustrator's roundness, right? We can choose whether or not it's sort of oval or oval this way. Maybe I shrink it a little bit from there and bring up the ovalness. And you can see how that's going. And of course we can add any point that we would like along the way to sort of change the color and style there. And of course you have this flip button, which essentially takes your colors and flips them around, no matter how many points you have. Right here, flip, flip. Right here, flip, flip. I'll show you what it's like with radial. Flip, flip. And now I'm going to show you a normal gradient. We're going to talk about the angular gradient. The angular gradient essentially is carving out a circle, starting the circle at one point, rotating all the way until it becomes the other color. Now, you have two little controls here which show that the two colors are essentially meeting around the same point. What I can do is take my dark blue. It's very hard to see, but I'll click it and I'll pull it up. And you can see I'm adjusting now the radial gradient as to what point the blue starts. I can also take the light blue and you can see that rotating around the big circle that's inside. And that's the angular gradient. And of course you can always flip that, right? Let me show you. That's a little bit more dramatic of a flip example. And just like with other gradients, you can add different points. So you could really get a very interesting looking gradient out of the angular gradient. That sort of looks like a 2001 Space Odyssey scene to it. So now I feel like we've covered gradients, and finally I want to talk to you about filling things with patterns and images. So I'm just going to delete everything, create a new rectangle, and in this fill I'm going to choose pattern. You can see it goes basically white. What I'll do is I'll choose different patterns. Here we have a grungy type texture. This looks like a grass, right? Here's sort of cloth or linen. Here's a leather. And we can do lots of things with these patterns, right? So right now this is tiled. Now if we would go to fill, you actually see the whole image there. It's a little hard to tell there, so what I'll do is I'll show you with one of my own images. I'll click choose image, and then I will go into my photo library and some cool pictures of sand castles here. Use this one, that looks good. And you can see it's hard for me to see the picture unless I resize it, and I mean, if this was a web design task, this would be pretty tough. Now the image is always aligned to the top left, so if I scale down, you can see the tiling happen. So this is what would happen. Essentially all these patterns are just tiling an image back and forth. This is a pretty large image, so obviously it's pretty slow when I go to scale it down. What I'll do instead of tile is I'll choose fill. And fill really goes left to right and fills your image. And it does in any dimension it can. It begins cropping when you get wider than the image is. You can see I pulled myself outside of the canvas. You can see even if I make it bigger, it does its best to scale up the image and stay within the bounds. So click back into this layer and I'll show you that. Here's a filled pattern. Here's a tiled version of it. So I'll zoom in here with Command plus and you'll see there is the pattern. I've made this thing way too big now. It's at 4,000 pixels. So I'm going to scale it back down and get this to a fairly manageable size. Now here's a tip too, when you're scaling things from really big to really small. You have a button up here that essentially allows you to really quickly snap to 100% of the canvas. And right now, my scale is down to 10% on this tile. I'm going to go ahead and type in 100%. And we can very easily and clearly see this sort of great or diagonal line pattern, checkerboardish, if you will. So that's how patterns and fills work. You can definitely use them to create a good amount of interest in your design. Coming up, we're going to take these patterns and fills and we're going to layer different fills. That's coming up next.